Hello, my name's Simon Turner and I'm the Managing Director of Fleet21, a company that advises and coaches clients on fleet driver safety and compliance. We're currently in the process of conducting an industry-wide survey on corporate attitudes to driver safety, which you can find on our website at www.fleet21.com. Many of the respondents so far have already raised questions about how to properly assess risk and ask how other organisations like theirs manage those risks. I thought it would be a good idea today to provide a brief overview of the key issues surrounding not just compliance obligations, but also around best practice. And so, over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to be talking to some of the industry's leading figures to give you an insight into the following areas. First, we'll look at getting some clarity on the legislation and penalties. John Lawrence is a Justice of the Peace who regularly sits in court to pass sentence on companies and directors who have fallen foul of health and safety laws relating to business drivers. I'll be asking John about just what a company can expect to go through if one of its drivers is involved in a serious accident. Secondly, we'll look at compliance basics, checks for company car drivers and grey fleet. Malcolm Maycock, Managing Director of Licence Bureau, a Fleet21 partner, will guide us through the checking procedures all companies should be doing as a matter of course, and not just for company car drivers but for those who use their own cars, their grey fleet, as well, and explain why those that don't do these checks could be leaving themselves open to serious risks. Next, we'll look at risk assessment. Andrew Bayne, Commercial Director of Atom, another Fleet21 partner, explains how individual risk assessment works and how intelligent e-learning interventions can bring great improvements in driver knowledge and attitude while reducing the need for more expensive in-car training solutions. We'll then look at driving dynamics, in-car training with a difference. Danny Buxton, former motor racing champion and head of driver training here at Fleet21, explains how driving dynamics, being able to understand and control a car's dynamic behaviour, is the real key to changing the hearts and minds of drivers and equipping them with the skills to react correctly to potentially dangerous situations on the road. And finally, we'll look at best practice with Tony Leigh, Head of Car Fleet Services at PricewaterhouseCoopers and responsible for a fleet of 2,500 cars. Best practice means different things to different companies, and Tony will discuss the different ways that companies prioritise the risks, often within tight budgets, and look at the benefits they get. And once we've covered those, we should hopefully have time for some questions, so we'll try and get through as many as we can in the time available. So let's start with a look at the law. Under current UK health and safety at work legislation, employers have a number of duty of care obligations to ensure that their staff are safe while driving on business. Whether driving a company car, hire car, pool car or even a private car, the rules are exactly the same. The car is treated as an extension of the workplace. This means all employers must ensure that any risks associated with employees making business journeys have been identified, assessed and minimised as far as is reasonably practicable. The relevant laws include the following. The Health and Safety at Work Act 1974. This defines the car as an extension of the workplace, and so the same rules apply to cars as would apply to any other piece of complex machinery. Simply passing a standard driving test is not appropriate training for a sales executive who's expected to travel well over 25,000 miles a year, keep a hectic schedule of appointments and regularly entertain clients. Employers have got a responsibility to ensure that their drivers have the appropriate skills to drive safely and responsibly, and that they are able to recognise and avoid situations that might cause them to behave otherwise. If your organisation consists of more than 5 employees, then the Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999 requires you to carry out a written risk assessment, not just regarding the risks to your drivers and your organisation, but also the risks to other road users who may be affected by your activities. You must have a company policy relating to business drivers and have received formal acceptance from those employees that they have read the policy and understand their responsibilities. You must also have procedures in place that prevent your organisation, intentionally or otherwise, from putting your drivers at risk in the course of their work. The Highway Code applies to all road users and includes information on the law and driving penalties. It is an offence for an employer to set work schedules that cause employees to break the speed limit or to introduce payment reward schemes that incentivise them to do so. And it isn't just out on the public road where employers have health and safety obligations to their employees. Any organisation with an employee car park or large facility with its own road network needs to include this in its risk assessment and ensure that all employees, whether driving or not, are as safe as possible from other staff drivers and or visitors using the facilities. Finally, there is the Corporate Manslaughter Bill. Although we've yet to see a prosecution relating to road safety, there is the provision within the Act to impose very strict penalties against any organisation that is successfully prosecuted. Let's talk to John Lawrence. John, as a Justice of the Peace, you've had many company directors stand before you in court after one of their employees has been involved in a road accident. Are there any common failings that you see on a regular basis?
Yes, there are. I'd say they broadly fall into two categories. With directors of smaller companies, it's really common for the directors to be simply unaware of their responsibilities. Even if they were aware, there might be a risk. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking you're too busy trying to keep the company going and win business to do anything about it. In larger companies, there is generally a much greater appreciation of the risks involved and a desire to have the correct policies in place. Problems are often lurking deeper in the organisation, where the policies are often poorly communicated and staff feel pressured to cut corners to deliver better results. Tight schedules mean that drivers have to rush about between meetings and spending too much time on the phone, even hands-free.
So what can a company director expect to happen if one of their employees is involved in a road accident?
Well, the first thing that will happen is that they'll get a visit from the police. It used to be just the Health and Safety Executive, but now the police will interview the relevant people under caution. They've also got the power to confiscate papers and equipment as evidence to use in court. They'll really delve deep to see not just whether or not there were policies or procedures in place, but also whether they were being properly followed. It's no good having a driver policy stuck on a shelf that everybody ignores.
And what happens then?
If the company has failed in its health and safety duties, then it and the directors are in trouble. There are two things that often strike directors hard. The first is the huge amount of time and stress involved in trying to defend themselves when they should be running their company. The second is how much more serious the whole business sounds when read out by lawyers in front of someone like me. It's held in a public courtroom too, so that experience can be humiliating.
So what about penalties then? What's in store if the directors are proved to have been negligent?
Well, in the event of a death, there's always corporate manslaughter, but it would have to be a really clear-cut case of willful negligence by the directors to be confident of a successful prosecution. In reality, the vast majority of offences are dealt with under the health and safety legislation, but the penalties can still be severe. There's a maximum £20,000 fine for each separate breach of health and safety legislation, and there could be several. The director responsible could be disqualified, and there could be negative publicity order against the company, so they are forced to publicise their conviction.
Thanks, John. The common thread running through the corporate manslaughter prosecutions that have happened to date is that they've all involved a willful negligence by directors in their refusal to rectify a high-risk situation that they had been previously warned could be very dangerous, and official sentencing guidelines in these circumstances say that any fine imposed should be in the region of 1 year's turnover, a figure that would put many companies out of business. The main issue with corporate manslaughter is that because it's such a serious offence, it carries a very high burden of proof in order to prosecute successfully. It is there to deal with willful negligence. Companies that are fully aware that something about their way of working is very dangerous and could result in death or serious injury if it isn't rectified. In our view, there would have to be little or no attempt at creating any kind of safe driving policy and a willful refusal to rectify any high-risk practices that the company directors had been made well aware of. In the business driver world, this might be akin to a situation where a company was actively creating work schedules and expectations of staff that meant that they were having to drive at excessive speed between appointments. Some may have complained already that they weren't being given enough time to get to those appointments. Some of the staff may have racked up speeding convictions on these journeys, and members of the public may have even complained to the company about dangerous driving or speeding by its employees. Throw in a lack of policy on mobile phone use, and this company has all the ingredients for a very serious incident on the roads that could have been foreseen. If you recognise your company in the above example, then corporate manslaughter may be a risk, and at the very least you need to write a driver policy and communicate it to staff immediately to try and halt some of those practices. In reality though, for most organisations the major risks are breaches of health and safety legislation, which we discussed with John Lawrence earlier in the presentation. John has seen many cases relating to accidents involving business drivers, and will usually consider the maximum penalties where a company has not taken any interest in driver safety. Any leniency in this approach would depend on what policies and practices were in place at the time, and whether the company has made any effort in improving those practices after the event. So, now we've seen what the risks are, what do we do about it? Malcolm Maycock is head of Fleet21 Partner Licence Bureau, an organisation that performs various checks on business drivers. Malcolm, why is it necessary to even perform these checks?
Simon, the HSE in 2003 produced a very simple common sense guide called Driving at Work, Managing Work-Related Road Safety, and it asks the following questions. Do you check the validity of the driving licence on recruitment and periodically thereafter? Does the job require anything more than a current driving licence, valid for the type of vehicle to be driven? That aside, common sense, Simon, tells you that if you're asking someone to use a piece of machinery, you want to know they are entitled to use it, qualified to use it, the machinery is fit for purpose, and if they are producing their own machinery to use, then obviously that it's legal for use.
Checking an employee's licence when they first join is a good start, but obviously they could commit offences after that check has been made. So how do you identify drivers who get points after their licence has been checked?
The licence checking process is continuous and, as you would expect, is based on the driver's risk and the number of points they've accumulated. We ask each driver to sign a consent form which allows us access to the DVO database direct. So there's no need to decipher one or many variations of UK licences, European licences or those around the world. Or more importantly, look at documents that may not have been updated by the driver, be copies or forgeries. Based on the thousands of checks we carry out daily, we were able to work with Buckingham University and Break the Road Safety Organisation to estimate that there are approximately 24,000 people driving illegally for companies in Britain today. During 2011, we found 1 in every 300 licences were invalid for business cover insurance. If these drivers were stopped or involved in an accident, then the company could, and often does, find themselves liable under law.
I think that point alone clearly demonstrates why organisations need to make sure they're doing these checks. But also an important and growing area seems to be the realisation that organisations also have to check their employees who use their own cars for business journeys, the so-called grey fleet. Many employers don't seem sure whether they should be checking or even if they've got the right to make those checks.
You're right, Simon. The grey fleet is becoming quite a concern, and absolutely they have the right to check. The employer has decided the employee's vehicle has basically become their company car and should therefore treat it as their own machinery. This is why checking insurance and the vehicle's roadworthiness is so important as well. Many people don't realise what constitutes a business journey and that, actually, they may not be covered. A standard personal, social, domestic and pleasure motor insurance policy will not normally only cover you to commute to and from one regular place of business. That means if you work at a different office one day a week or regularly attend training sessions away from the main office, they may well be classed as business journeys, and so you'll need appropriate business motor insurance. But the confusion doesn't even stop there. We estimate that around 20% of the policies we check, where the driver has certified that they are correct, are found to be the wrong type of cover.
What about cars, Malcolm? Company cars, generally new, and you assume they're regularly serviced, but someone using their own car might well have an older car. Is that an issue at all?
It shouldn't be an issue, provided it's well maintained and serviced and has a valid MOT. We can check all these things too, just to be sure. You'll be amazed at the number of drivers who know there are things wrong with their cars that could be dangerous. Often the simple fact they know someone is checking gets them to pay more attention and get those faults fixed more quickly. The main thing that the employer has to be concerned about is whether that car is fit for purpose.
Malcolm, thank you very much. Now, once the obvious risks have been covered, then we start to move on to the less obvious risks, working out if any of your drivers are a high risk and what to do with any that are. Andrew Bayne is Commercial Director of Atom, one of the world's leading developers of driver assessment and online education systems, and a Fleet21 partner. Andrew, can I start by asking you why an employer would want to assess each individual driver and what they might be looking for?
Hi, Simon. Yeah, for one, employers have a duty of care to all employees and should want to have as much information on their individual records as possible, and that includes anything to do with driving. Historically, it probably took a crash to get an employee to be classified as high risk and be sent on a day's in-car training, a totally reactive approach which only addressed a tiny proportion of a company's workforce. That said, it is really only with the advancement of technology that a totally proactive, cost-effective program for all can now be deployed. Look at it as preventative medicine for the workforce. The argument that companies must put every member of staff through a full in-car driver training program simply does not wash anymore. Employers need to be cleverer about identifying the main risks and dealing with them sensibly, especially in the current business climate. Individual assessment allows a company to build an audit trail on each employee, identify those drivers at a higher risk, and then hand this information to the trainer to target their training on the in-car day.
So, if we find out that some of our drivers are deemed to be higher risk than others, what's the best way to deal with this?
Well, it really depends on the risks identified, Simon. The beauty of the Atom system used by Fleet21 and their clients is that it not only assesses a driver's attitude, but their knowledge and skill too. The output of that 20-minute assessment then triggers a selection of remedial online modules, each with a short assessment at the back end, which in turn helps to create the all-important personalised audit trail for each employee. Low-risk drivers might show a need, for example, to brush up on motorway driving or road signage, and so they'll get specific modules on those topics. Medium-risk drivers might demonstrate a general lack of road sense and need to work their way through a few more modules like hazard perception or dealing with distractions, say.
And what about the really high-risk drivers?
Well, yeah, the high-risk drivers are often the most aggressive drivers, those prone to speeding and road rage, and those who show a lack of understanding of their responsibilities to other road users. They will end up being tasked to complete most of the e-learning modules, but this still might not be enough. These are the drivers that employers should really think seriously about sending on an in-car driving skills course that can demonstrate why their attitude and behaviour could be highly dangerous to both the company brand and to other road users.
How often do you need to repeat these assessments? Is once enough, or do you have to do it on a regular basis?
Well, really, it should be seen as part of an ongoing programme. Staff change all the time, so new people will need to be assessed as they join the organisation in question. It is also important to see if the intervention from the previous year has affected a change in either the attitude or the behaviour of that individual. And so by repeating the process every year, an employer can evaluate whether the process is working or not.
Andrew, thank you very much. OK, so having dealt with the various checks, risk assessment and e-learning solutions, let's get on to what is often the most difficult bit of the puzzle to get right, in-car driver training. There are lots of different views on driver training and lots of different courses at different prices. At Fleet21, we've opted for a course based on driving dynamics as our central driver safety offering, which we've designed to be delivered from as little as £99 per driver. We also offer more traditional on-road courses, as well as parking and eco-driving modules. Danny Buxton is Head of Driver Training at Fleet21, a former Renault Clio Cup champion and British touring car driver. Danny, what is driving dynamics and why are you such a fan?
Yeah, hi Simon. Driving dynamics is about understanding car behaviour. If you find yourself in a situation, for example, where you have to make an emergency manoeuvre, the laws of physics will make the car react in a specific way depending on how you steer or brake to try and avoid the incident. We at Fleet21, we teach drivers how to react calmly and correctly to try and avoid and minimise the chances of actually having the accident in the first place.
And how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, good question. We create a number of driving exercises in a safe, controlled environment that allow the driver to practice the skills needed under, obviously, supervision. The exercises simulate common scenarios, such as emergency braking on a motorway, skidding in a corner due to going too fast, and dealing with slippery surfaces such as wet leaves or ice, everyday situations. By teaching drivers in this way, we can help them learn to control the car much more skillfully, but also help them understand the limits of the car and the road. So actually, they often drive in a much safer manner afterwards, and are therefore less likely to get themselves into trouble in the first place.
Danny, you're a successful racing driver, as are all your team of instructors. I often get asked why we use racing drivers to teach safer driving, as it sounds very counterintuitive. How would you answer that?
Well, the first thing to understand, Simon, is that we're not teaching people how to drive quickly. It's a fact of life that a lot of accidents happen at high speed. Therefore, reacting correctly can give you a chance to avoid or minimise any serious damage or injury. Reacting badly can make an already dangerous situation much, much worse and involve other road users. Professional racing drivers have car control skills, although they're not always that evident on a racetrack, that help us avoid crashing whilst driving quickly and cornering and braking hard. These are actually the same skill set you need when the person in front of you on a wet motorway brakes hard at 70 miles an hour, or if you are to avoid a pedestrian who isn't looking and steps out in front of you.
And it's something anyone is able to learn?
For sure, I'd say so, and that's how we base our courses. I don't think we've had anyone fail to understand the concept, although people learn at different speeds, and our course allows for that. One of the great benefits of driving dynamics is the positive effect it has on driving attitude, whatever your previous level. It helps to rein in overconfident, aggressive drivers because they realise they weren't quite the racing god they thought they were, and they need to be more respectful of the car and the conditions to stay in control. And secondly, it helps those who are less confident by giving them a new skill set and helping them actually realise they're capable of handling a car much more confidently than previously thought.
Okay, thank you very much, Danny. So, having covered some of the key issues surrounding business driver safety and compliance, what do other companies do? And how do they judge what level of action to take? Is there a best practice standard to aspire to? Tony Leigh is the fleet manager at PwC. Tony, you're responsible for one of the UK's larger corporate fleets with around 2,500 cars. What's your view on best practice?
Well, Simon, best practice means different things to different people and different organisations. For example, in the current climate, budgets are very tight, as you know, and that can't be an excuse to do nothing. So most companies should be trying to identify where the higher risks are and spending their budget wisely to mitigate those risks.
Exactly. Well, what do you think are the essential elements?
Well, certainly regular licence checking is a very important element for company car drivers and for grey fleet drivers. And in respect of grey fleet drivers, it's very important they do have business insurance cover. Companies need to make sure that there are robust policies in place to ensure drivers know that and know what their responsibilities are, and that these policies are clearly communicated.
Can you give me an example of how that might happen?
Sure, it's quite common for field sales teams perhaps to be in constant contact with the office by mobile phone. And whilst the employer may have a policy that says they should always use a hands-free kit or stop to take the call, unfortunately it's one of those laws that gets more ignored than abide by. So it's a policy that's easy to ignore. It's also easy for, let's say, office-bound colleagues to contact them while they're on the road. Our own policy at PwC is that there are no in-car calls whatsoever, hands-free or handheld, whilst driving. And we take that to a disciplinary offence if a person gets prosecuted for that. Our drivers are asked to use answer phones as the best method, and then stop when it's safe and legal to do so. And if somebody calls our office staff, for example, if a manufacturer calls me, I'll ask them to hang up and call me back when they're not driving.
That seems like a sensible policy and neatly illustrates your responsibilities beyond your own drivers. What are your views on driver training?
I think driver training has to be targeted. There's no way I would introduce blanket driver training. You're actually hitting drivers who are probably quite safe anyway and don't need training. So you need to have a risk assessment strategy in place to identify where you need to target your driver training and identify high-risk drivers. And then perhaps put in a mixture of on the road and distant learning or whatever else to try and mitigate your highest risk.
So, Tony, what would be your advice to employers who are worried about driver risk but maybe unsure where to start?
Yeah, I think the best thing is to get a good policy in place, and you have to communicate that to everybody. We communicate electronically. We have a driver user manual, and we have policies on our intranet site. And by doing that, you can make sure that people know where to find it, make sure they understand it, and that also the policy will be monitored, and any breaking of it is a serious offence. That's a very inexpensive first thing to do, to set out your policies and to set out what people have to do in various circumstances.
Tony Leigh, thank you very much. So let's have a quick recap of what we've learned. If one of your drivers is involved in a serious accident, then the police will investigate first. They will inspect your policies and work practices and interview the relevant directors and employees under caution to decide if there's a case for prosecution. The police are constantly improving their methods of accident investigation and can normally determine the exact circumstances surrounding any incident, including the speeds and behaviour of the vehicles involved and who or what was the cause. Currently, the vast majority of company prosecutions are for breaches of health and safety, and while corporate manslaughter has been a hot topic of discussion over the last few years, there hasn't yet been a prosecution that relates to business drivers, so it's difficult to know how it would be applied in practice. The probable risks to most employers are therefore likely to be a £20,000 fine for each breach of health and safety law, the possibility of a director being disqualified, and a negative publicity order where the organisation is forced to advertise its conviction. And not forgetting the extensive costs in management time and resources to mount a defence. The health and safety laws say an employer must take whatever actions are reasonable and practicable to ensure the safety of its drivers and other road users. The first step should therefore be an assessment of the risks and creation of a clear driver policy that mitigates those risks and outlines any personal responsibilities the driver has. It's essential that the policy is then communicated clearly to the relevant staff and that a system is in place to monitor how well your staff stick to it. This is a very simple and low-cost step to implement, and the courts would view the lack of such policies very negatively. You should then look at what checks might be relevant, including licence checks for all drivers and insurance and MOT checks for those using their own cars. Remember, research done by Licence Bureau estimated that there were 24,000 business drivers driving illegally, and that a staggering 20% of all grey fleet driver insurance is for the wrong type of cover. As we start to look at driver suitability, we should then look at online risk assessment systems for individual drivers. The Fleet21 ATOM system assesses drivers for knowledge, skill and attitude and includes a full suite of built-in e-learning intervention modules at no extra cost. This allows us to see the level of risk posed by each driver and to ensure any risks highlighted can be quickly dealt with. Finally, high-risk drivers should be considered for an in-car driving skills program such as Fleet21's Driving Dynamics course. This can help to rein in overconfident drivers or aggressive drivers and boost less confident ones, while giving both the skills and knowledge to react calmly, confidently and correctly in any potentially dangerous situation, minimising the chances of either injury or vehicle damage. Well, that concludes the presentation, so thank you all for listening. I hope it's been of use to you. If you'd like to know more, you can visit our website at www.fleet21.com, or you can call us on 0845 689 7121. I'd also like to thank John Lawrence, Malcolm Maycock, Andrew Bayne, Danny Buxton and Tony Leigh for their insight into all of these issues. I'll answer questions in a minute, but if you wish to discuss any specific driver safety issues further, we've also got a virtual exhibition stand here at TCD Live, where you can chat with me and my colleagues during the rest of the day. Thank you.